Welcome back to the AI Daily Brief. Today, we are talking about some practical, useful frameworks for scaling AI. In other words, moving beyond the pilot stage. And the specific frame of reference and framework that we're going to be using comes from a new guide from OpenAI called From Experiments to Deployments, A Practical Path to Scaling AI. But even outside of this particular document, it is very clear to me that a huge theme heading into next year is going to be this idea of whole org transformation and post-pilot, post-experimentation phase artificial intelligence inside the enterprise. If you look at literally any study of AI adoption and impact, the story is pretty clear. Massive and increasing adoption and usage, initial extremely promising ROI and impact, but some real barriers to converting individual value to whole org value. Indeed, the very first set of charts in McKinsey's State of AI doc shows this really crisply. On the one hand, the percentage of organizations that are using AI in at least one function continues to reach new highs, and increasingly it is spread across multiple functions. But a huge number of organizations remain in really early stages. McKinsey found 32% still experimenting, and another 30% in the piloting stages, meaning just 38% total were scaling or fully scaled, and only 7% of those were in that fully scaled phase. Now, to be honest, the 7% in fully scaled, I don't think is all that bad. When you have a technology that is going to impact every single part of the organization, I would actually be surprised if those 7% actually are fully scaled. There's just so much to do to get there. The more concerning piece, especially if you are in that cohort, is the 62% that are still in those really early stages. I genuinely think that if you head into 2026 in those stages, you have to treat yourself as officially behind. One thing we've recently done at Superintelligent is, as part of our agent readiness audits, we were very frequently recommending some version of quick win pilots as part of the initial things to do, especially for organizations that found themselves in the explorer stage, which is very early in their AI journey. I've now basically hard blocked and demanded the removal of any sort of mention of quick win pilots. I just think that if we're talking in that sort of language and acting like a couple of quick wins is an okay place to be, it's doing our customers a disservice. This does not mean that I think that organizations have to have everything wired right now. I think it's fine to build momentum with pilots that show value quickly. But I think that the frame of reference and the overall vision for this has to be systemic. I think organizations need to be thinking comprehensively and systematically, or else they risk falling farther and farther behind. Which brings us to this new guide from OpenAI, From Experiments to Deployments, A Practical Path to Scaling AI. Now, the folks over at OpenAI have been producing this sort of resource more regularly, and I think what's valuable about this is not just that it's a sort of from the horse's mouth kind of document, although that is useful. It's also valuable because it reflects not just their best insights, but the aggregated wisdom that comes from their boatload of enterprise relationships. Kicking us off, they reiterate this problem that we've been talking about for the last couple of minutes, that there is increasingly a divide between laggers and leaders, and while some get stuck in pilots, others are weaving AI into daily operations and customer products. Now, they don't put it quite this crisply, but to me at core, there are 4 big mental shifts that OpenAI is suggesting as a basis for all of this work. The first is a shift from thinking about tools to thinking about systems. In their introduction section, they write, "For years, companies have focused on validating whether software was fit for purpose. The approach was simple: start small, test a specific use case, and scale once results are proven. This worked when technology evolved slowly and served a single department at a time. AI moves differently. Its capabilities evolve in weeks, not quarters, and its impact reaches every part of the organization. Success depends less on a single tool's performance and more on how quickly teams can learn, adapt, and apply AI to solve the problems in front of them. These shifts demand a new operating rhythm that balances speed with structure and evolves as fast as the technology itself." I actually think that breaking out of the tools-based view of software is way more challenging than many organizations are realizing. When you think about the entire structure of information around technology and innovation, so much of it is anchored to this old tool-based world. The biggest enterprise research and innovation company in the world is Gartner, $6 billion a year in revenue, $20 billion in market cap, and their most popular tool is their Magic Quadrant. The Magic Quadrant is, of course, all about helping enterprises pick which tools. They divide things into a quadrant of categories like challenges, leaders, niche players, and visionaries, and plot companies on that axis. The problem with this, of course, is that when it comes to AI, the difference in your organizational success will have almost nothing to do with whether you choose OpenAI or Microsoft Copilot or Google Gemini. Sorry to all my friends who work with those companies. That's not to say that different models won't be better or worse at different purposes. But when it comes to whether an enterprise gets the most out of AI, it will absolutely be based on how good are the systems that they put around AI. And so this entire tool-based frame of reference kind of needs to get booted out the window. So that's the first big mental shift. The second big mental shift is just thinking at a new velocity. Part of the reason that we can't get stuck in the tool-based way of thinking is that the tools themselves don't stay in one place for very long. One of the more remarkable charts in this entire document, they went back and looked across ChatGPT and the API and found that there had been a new feature released approximately every 3 days this year. That is absolutely insane. And it also creates an incredible organizational burden for companies that are trying to adopt all of that new capacity. It has been clear for some time that the capability set of AI tools vastly outstrips the ability of business users to put them into practice. And I don't see that gap doing anything but expanding. A third big mental shift has to do with leadership and innovation. And there are really two parts of this. The first is that because AI is cross-cutting, innovation that happens in one team can actually be relevant for another team in a way that was not the case before. When your sales team was using specialized data enrichment software to help with its sales prospecting, that wasn't necessarily going to help marketing. However, now, there are certain types of prompts and use cases that sales could discover that would be useful for marketing. As OpenAI puts it, innovation can come from any team. A marketing analyst they write who automates reporting can find use cases that scale across the whole company. And that gets at the second part of this shift. Solutions from anywhere doesn't just mean from any team, it also means from any type of employee. There is no seniority level that is a prerequisite for figuring out how to use AI better. In fact, one of the things that we talk about very frequently on this show is how that it's still early enough that there's basically no experts, just people who have more time on task and more reps with these tools. All that comes together for OpenAI to present a vision of compounding ROI. And I think this is really valuable. It's very easy to get stuck in thinking about different types of impact or different types of ROI as disconnected from one another. In other words, this AI use case is a time saver. This use case is a cost saver. That really exciting one, that's a new revenue generator. OpenAI is suggesting that instead we think about these things as cumulative and linked, and ultimately compounding. Okay, so 4 big mental shifts from tools to systems, speed of change, solutions from anywhere, and compounding ROI. So what overall is the AI framework for creating a repeatable system for scaling AI? 4 parts. The first is setting the foundations, establishing executive alignment, governance, and data access. The second is creating AI fluency, building literacy, champion networks, and sharing learnings across teams. The third is scoping and prioritization, capturing and prioritizing ideas through a repeatable intake process focused on business impact. Fourth and finally, building and scaling products, combining orchestration, measurement, and feedback loops to deliver safely and efficiently. You can see they put it in this cumulative and repeating cycle, where from those foundations, you layer AI fluency, scope and prioritization, and then building and scaling products, and have that iteration cycle throughout. So let's talk about foundations first. Within each of these categories, OpenAI gives a set of steps, almost like a recipe for what an organization could do to start to think in these more systematic terms. So for example, in the context of the foundation step, step 1 they have is assessing your maturity. Step 2 is bringing executives into AI early. Step 3 is strengthening access to data. Step 4 is designing governance for motion. Step 5 is setting clear goals and incentives. Now, a lot of our work at Superintelligent is, of course, in and around these 0 to 1 moments. And so a lot of it is resonant. That maturity assessment is an incredibly important step because usually what you're going to find is that an organization's readiness for AI and agents is very jagged. There are certain pockets of the organization that are ahead and optimized for exactly the sort of iterative adoption that is required, whereas other parts of the organization, not necessarily the ones that you would think, might lag for reasons that aren't just technical. But the point, of course, is that you have to know where you stand before you can build a program to move the whole organization together. On the idea of bringing executives into AI early, it is absolutely true, but one important note that builds on what we've seen is that this needs to be a two-way buy-in recruitment. Yes, executives need to be brought into AI early and be seen to be using these tools and changing how they work because of them, but they also need to have a ground-level view and a pulse from what employees are thinking. I think that when ChatGPT first came out and enterprise adoption first started, people might have assumed that it would be executive buy-in that was the blocker, but in fact, it has often been the opposite, where executives get super excited and actually kind of exhaust their employees by pouring too many new things on them at once. Both are important. You just have to have a bi-directional conversation about buy-in from all different parts of the organization. On the idea of governance, you might remember that when I did some research and analysis across the thousands and thousands of interviews we've conducted, one really interesting stat that stood out was that organizations that had robust articulated governance programs around AI scored on average 6.6 points higher on our 100-point agent readiness scale. It was the single biggest differentiating factor in terms of how much impact it had if that governance program was there versus if it wasn't. They suggest creating a cross-functional center of excellence, and that's a pattern we see a lot. A last note from Foundations is around the data. They write, reliable data and tools underpin every AI initiative. Start with low-sensitivity datasets to move quickly while improving quality and governance in parallel. And again, this is just a framework, but this, I think, actually reveals how much easier it is to say this stuff versus actually do it. In fact, when I was thinking about the Foundations piece, I think it might be valuable to think about Foundations not as a thing that you do in day 0 before the other phases. They basically have Foundations as day 0, AI fluency as day 30, scope and prioritize as day 60, build and scale as day 90. And I know that's just a demonstration example to get people thinking in relative terms. But I might actually put Foundations as an ongoing process that happens throughout and around all the other parts of this iterative framework. If you think about just 3 categories of these foundations, that leadership team alignment that I was talking about, governance that can evolve as the technology evolves, which is extremely important and very different than some other types of governance structures that we've dealt with in the past, and what I'm calling loosely data improvement, which means a continual improvement of the quality of the data, the readiness of the data, as well as the access and provisioning of the data, which is no mean feat in and of itself. These are things that are not ultimately going to get done once and just be done. They are instead ongoing processes that will continue to shape the relative success or failure of AI initiatives throughout the life cycle of those initiatives. So of course, we had AI's help to modify the visual slightly to show Foundations as a process that happens throughout and around the rest of the work. Let's move on to the next phase though, creating AI fluency. Once again, with this unnamed dialectic between leaders and laggers, they write, many organizations roll out AI tools before building skills, and adoption and experimentation stalls. The companies progressing fastest treat AI as a discipline that must be learned, reinforced, and rewarded. So what are their suggestions? First step they suggest is scale learning foundations and then tailoring it by role. So for example, make sure that there's some common basis of understanding around prompting and perhaps other everyday use cases before starting to hone in function by function. Next step, create rituals that sustain learning, basically making this an organizational habit, not a short-term initiative. Step 3, building champions networks and subject matter experts. This is basically the human side of that center of excellence, where you create a mechanism for people who are getting out ahead of their peers to share what they are learning back into the system. Relatedly, step 4, recognizing and rewarding experimentation. Basically, OpenAI is suggesting to make success highly visible, highlighting the teams, the individuals, the groups that can connect AI usage to results. A couple things I want to double click on here. This idea of champions networks is one of the more ubiquitous ideas that we see, but one of the most powerful. Again, going back to this idea of no experts yet, just people with more practice, one of the things that a champions network does is it rightly recognizes that to get really good at AI, you have to get good at AI in context. And it doesn't so much matter what any external experts say about how to use AI if it doesn't translate to your specific organizational environment. For that reason, it is incredibly valuable when you start to have people who are in different roles within your organization who have done the work of translating the general lessons to the specific organizational context and who can then share that with the rest of the organization. Every single enterprise, no matter how far behind you are, has these champions internally that are just waiting to be recognized and organized, and they are an incredibly powerful resource. On step 4, this idea of rewarding experimentation, I very much agree, but I think that if we are thinking systematically, it needs to go a step farther. It shouldn't just be recognizing and rewarding experimentation. There needs to be a mechanism for distributing new best practices, use cases, great prompts, etc. across the organization. If you look at most new tools, most new technologies, It's a small handful of people that figure out all the use cases and best practices, and then the rest of us just copy them. Organizations should be set up to have a similar sort of distribution mechanism. That can just be your Teams or your Slack account, but it still needs to be intentionally designed. In other words, you don't just want to recognize and reward experimentation. You want that experimentation to filter into the rest of the system as well. One last note, which is sort of captured in Create Rituals that Sustain Learning, but I think maybe deserves its own highlight as well, is that in addition to, quote, creating consistent spaces for teams to test ideas, share outcomes, and learn from peers, all of which is great, the even simpler part of this is that you have to create official, formal time allocated away from normal work and to learning these tools. The key paradox across these more than 1,000 interviews that we did in the middle of this year were that people were too busy to learn the thing that saves them time. And especially as we move to a world where there are more and more AI usage mandates, they have to come with formal space, chopped away from other types of work to do the AI learning. Okay, now with phase 3 and phase 4, we move away from just sort of general AI usage to some of the more advanced opportunities that are in this framework of compounding ROI, not just about employee productivity or even organizational efficiency, but actually translate into the ROI that ultimately is the one that matters most for the long-term success of the organization, which is revenue generation and new revenue. In many ways, this is the part where OpenAI is trying to provide a framework for organizations that maybe haven't made the leap from those foundational and AI fluency stages to really developing new products and opportunities with AI deeply integrated and embedded. So phase 3, they call scope and prioritize. And the objective they write is to create a clear, repeatable system for capturing, evaluating, and prioritizing opportunities across the organization. This one is simple to write, but does require work to do well. Step 1, they suggest, is to create open channels for idea intake. And this very much harkens back to the idea that innovation can come from anywhere in the era of AI. Basically, rather than people having to work through the traditional channels, anyone should be encouraged to submit ideas, be it for use cases or new products or whatever, in a formal way. From there, they suggest hosting discovery sessions that can turn some of those ideas into prototypes. They write, these sessions act as both filters and accelerators. The strongest advance to proof of concept. Others feed insights back into the backlog to guide future work. And as the scoping happens, they actually share their own little magic quadrant for how to prioritize different ideas. On the x-axis, they have low effort to high effort in terms of how much lift it takes to actually get a thing done. And on the y, low value to high value. So for example, a low value but high effort idea is one that you're likely to want to deprioritize. Basically, the juice isn't worth the squeeze in that case. A low value but low effort idea might be more in the realm of self-service. I think actually a lot of our day-to-day time-saving use cases fit in that bucket. Meeting note summarization, email assistance, things like that. Remember, low value doesn't mean no value, or you should ignore it. It just means when it comes to the organization as a whole, it's comparatively lower than something that, for example, is going to generate new revenue. That's why they designate it self-service. Now, high value, low effort, that's just kind of a no-brainer, right? If you can do something with little effort that creates high value for the organization, you should just do it. And to the extent that you can find those ideas, they're a really good thing to run with. Maybe the most interesting category from an organizational planning perspective is in the high value, high effort quadrant, where something really good could come out of it, but it's going to take a lot of work to get there. And unfortunately, I think for enterprises, a lot of the best use cases, in fact, the vast majority of the best use cases are going to be in that bucket. And that's why organizations need to scope and prioritize them, because you can only do so many of those high value, high effort initiatives. Now, one last note that I think is a really valuable call out is they suggest, as you are doing this as an organization, to design for reuse from the very beginning. As you prioritize, look for recurring patterns, code, orchestration flows, or data assets that can support multiple use cases. Designing with reuse in mind compounds speed, lowers costs, and creates a technical memory that turns each project into a launchpad for the next. Basically, once again, don't view these efforts in isolation. View them as part of a larger system and see what can be reused from each process to make the next thing move a little bit faster or work a little bit better. Which brings us to phase 4, building and scaling products. The objective they suggest is to develop a consistent, reliable method for turning new ideas and use cases into internal and external products. And the watchword of this whole section is iteration. Building with AI, they write, is uniquely powerful because AI systems can learn and adapt rather than relying on fixed logic. AI products improve through repeated iterations of the project itself. Each new version is assessed on how it responds to real data, context, and whether it is reliable and cost-effective. As teams run evaluations, integrate new information, and adjust system prompts or workflows, these refinements strengthen the final product. So their set of tips for this include 1, building the right teams. And really here, they're talking about combining technical and other types of talent. Pair engineers, they suggest, with subject matter experts who define success, data leads who ensure access to the right information, and an executive sponsor to remove blockers. Basically, if these things are systemic and cross-organizational, get all the types of people that you need rather than developing them in isolation. Step 2, unblock the path. They argue that most slowdowns stem from access and approvals, and certainly it is the case that the biggest constraint on AI's impact in the organization is organizational inertia. This, by the way, though, is also why I think governance should be viewed as something that is constantly iterated as well. In fact, it will very often be when you are getting close to this actual building and scaling products phase that you figure out where your governance is insufficient and have to update it. Step 3 is basically taking a build path that is iterative by design. Build incrementally and measure as you go. This is a little bit more native for small companies and startups, but can be really hard for big, older organizations that have very ingrained processes that don't move at the pace of AI. I think there is a lot of work in unlearning some of those systems, but that's ultimately what they're suggesting. So that is OpenAI's practical path to scaling AI. I think the way to think about this is not as some gospel framework that you have to follow exactly, but much more like a cookbook that has a bunch of recipes that, if you prepared all of them in some combination, in some sequence, would probably add up to a pretty kick-butt feast. The metaphors are getting a little tortured here, but you get what I'm saying. As we head into 2026, the key thing, I think, more than anything else, is to think systematically and systemically. Getting the most out of AI is going to be a whole org effort. These things can't be done in isolation. And so whether it's this framework or another one that you've developed yourself or have from someone else, if you are thinking systemically, I think you are going to be ahead. Anyways, friends, that is going to do it for today's AI Daily Brief. Appreciate you listening or watching as always. And until next time, peace.